It's after 10 is the time, and you are listening to Speak to Sadiq on LBC, with me in the role of Robin to the Mayor of London's Batman, and you in the position of asking all the questions, which you can do by dialing 03456060973 right now and putting your question to the Mayor. I'll begin with a text. This is from Mark. No, he writes with 6 O's, not Mayor Khan again. Come on, James, instead of handing him the hankies to wipe away his crocodile tears, put your considerable metaphoric political foot on his throat and get him to splutter and squirm in his seat. I won't insult you with a list of questions, but this buffoon has to be accountable for the mess that London is in at the moment. Please don't let him spout self-propaganda codswallop. And another one, just to kick things off. James, tell him to stop squashing cab drivers. If he wants to reduce emissions, there is a magic word for, and if he wants to learn what it is, tell him to contact me. Unfortunately, that's unsigned. Nice to see you, Mr. Mayor. How are you?
Not bad. It's Boris from Whitehall, I think. It's actually good to be back in the studio. I mean, obviously, I speak on a regular basis to your hard-working journalists, but it's lovely to be back here and also to hopefully take calls from your listeners as well.
We will crack on with that imminently, but obviously, as ever, I like to get in a couple of questions of my own. Are the Insulate Britain protests here to stay?
I hope they will raise the really important issues they're raising in a different way. I don't support the way they've been protesting. I think protest has a really important role to play in our democracy.
Did you support them at the start? Did you think if maybe once or twice makes the point and then...
No, I think
away?
The issue I definitely support.
Sure.
We have to do a better job in insulating our homes because it helps with not just reducing carbon emissions, it reduces people's bills and it helps create jobs. That's why in London we have a retrofitting revolution to address this. I support the right to protest. I think, though, it should be lawful, peaceful and safe. I don't support the way these protesters are going about their business, not just because of the disruption, not just because of the appointments being delayed and sometimes cancelled, but actually I think it's putting people off what is an important issue in the weeks before COP26.
What would you do if you were in charge? How would you make the point more effectively, given that it's the first question I'm asking you, precisely because it has succeeded in achieving so much prominence? Even people who hate their every utterance and every gesture talk about them. I think the people who hate them talk about them a lot more than the people who are sort of supportive of the cause but concerned about the tactics. So what would you do if I put you in charge?
The things we're doing is, despite some of the protests we've seen in the last few weeks, my retrofitting plan was announced before. Some of the things that the government will be announcing, hopefully in Glasgow, but also leaders from across the globe will be announced despite some of the protests in the last few weeks. But look, it's the middle group of people we've got to try and persuade to do things to reduce carbon emissions, to raise awareness, and those people are being put off this really important issue.
We've heard all this before. So in terms of what would you do differently and new, given that the protests they've conducted in the last few weeks have been different and new? You don't have to have an answer. They don't. I don't think have a plan B. But can you think of something that might be more effective?
Well, there's lots of things. You ought to be organising now to get communities across the country realising how important Glasgow is. You remember 2005, the work done across the country in advance of the G7 summit in the UK, which led to debt being cancelled and aid being increased. That's a good example of citizen power. And what we did in 2005 was citizens across the globe lobbied the 7 leaders in the G7, which led to some of the changes we're seeing. And that sort of lobbying, those campaigning, those marches, the concerts and so forth were lawful, peaceful and safe.
And before we go to the phones, with your lawyer hat on, although it's not your specific area of expertise from your days as a lawyer, what can be done? Because the Home Secretary makes a lot of conference-friendly noises. It's only 2 years ago she said she was going to halve the number of refugees arriving by dinghy. That wasn't mentioned in her speech this week. But as it stands, these injunctions that they've taken out, are they going to work? Can you criminalise or jail people for sitting down in the middle of a road?
So the tactic being used is to get an injunction from a judge. And if you disobey the injunction, you're in contempt of court, which can lead to imprisonment. And a judge, when weighing up whether to grant an injunction, will look at the balancing, right to protest with the disruption caused and the danger caused as well. So no judge will give an injunction unless he or she's satisfied they've balanced these competing interests.
Can you give like a blanket injunction to say if you ever sit down in the middle of a road, you will be
No, it's got to be specific.
Contempt of court. So to be specific, would they need to know where the next protest was going to be? I'm just wondering whether you think that these injunctions are legally efficacious.
I think they're the best there is available.
So
bear in mind,
you don't
I think it's difficult. I think, and this is my concern, by the way.
Sure.
By the way, one of the unintended consequences of these often unlawful, often dangerous, often not peaceful protests is it's encouraging the government in the guise of the Home Secretary and the government to bring in new laws to close what they think are loopholes, which I think is not a good thing to do.
So if I was going to put money on whether or not you think these injunctions are going to succeed in stopping the Insulate Britain
I think they'll move on. It's displacing. So what you're seeing is so that they're now not doing M25 because of the injunction at M25.
Yeah.
They're not doing some of the motorways because of the injunction there. There's noise about them going to other parts of the country where there isn't an injunction. And the question I think those who are organising the protests have got to ask themselves is what is the objective, what is the ends for the means? And I think that the ends should be persuading national governments to change their policies, trying to get public opinion on our side to try and make sure we move the agenda on both climate change and air pollution.
So out of interest, if I pledged live on the radio to lie down in front of a bulldozer, for example, to stop a development from unfolding at, I don't know, maybe a major international airport, could that be injuncted in the same way that the Insulate Britain? Would that be subject to the same legal devices, do you think?
No, because I think you're making these threats, or what we call blagging in the business, may not cover it. I think if you were to be on the way to a place where you'd given advance notice of protest, and then I'm sure somebody whose life is being disrupted may well go to the courts to get an injunction.
To the phones, Mr. Mayor.
That was free advice, by the way. No invoice coming your way, James. The first call is from a lovely part of London, East London, Dagenham, and it's Jackson. Good morning, Jackson.
Morning. My question is in regard to Sarah Everard and Daniel Morgan. There are some places in the world when you're stopped by a police officer, you are entitled to ask to see his supervisor, for his supervisor to be present. However, in this case, we may not have supervisors because there's a shortfall in police numbers. A police officer should give you a document for you to attend a police station rather than getting into his car. However, I voted for you twice, and I'm disappointed I did, in your giving your full support to Cressida Dick. Since the Daniel Morgan inquiry, I'm sure she has not put across your desk any piece of paper sketching out how she is going to tackle deaths in police custody.
To the question, Jackson, if you could.
Yes, the question is, I'm sure since the Daniel Morgan inquiry, she has not put a piece of paper across your desk.
Okay, so has the Commissioner...
Jackson raises a number of different points. The last one was deaths in police custody, and he raised two really important issues. One is obviously Sarah Everard, and secondly is the issue of the Daniel Morgan inquiry that took place. So I'll deal with the issue of, and you also raised the issue of stop and search and supervision of police. So let me deal with a number of the issues that you're raising, Jackson. We police in our country by consent, and one of the things that causes me huge concern is that public confidence has been shattered in the police as a consequence of what we've discovered in relation to the awful abduction, rape and murder of Sarah Everard, a serving police officer, using his position of power and influence to get Sarah into his car and then doing the things that he did. And we've also then discovered, Jackson, that this police officer joined first Kent Police, then the Civil Nuclear Constabulary, then the Met Police, with a number of serious allegations against him. Allegations of indecent exposure, but also some misogynistic, racist, homophobic WhatsApp groups and other issues about him. And that's one of the reasons why it's important for not just the police, but for somebody outside the police to look into all that's gone on to make sure we can restore public confidence for the reasons you allude to in relation to stop and search and other issues as well. And that's why it's unlike me, Jackson, to say this publicly or privately. I support Priti Patel in relation to a full and comprehensive inquiry looking into not just what happened in this particular case with Sarah Everard, but also wider issues around police culture, around discipline, around professional standards, around whether police feel confident reporting allegations of misbehaviour against other officers across the country. It's so important we restore that trust and confidence.
Have you had anything at all from the Commissioner on the question? Because Daniel Morgan is relevant here. There was an inquiry into that. God knows it took long enough. It was like pulling hen's teeth. It concluded that the Met had behaved in an institutionally corrupt fashion. This follows upon the Macpherson report that found that the Met was institutionally racist, and I think that the Sarah Everard case makes a fairly strong case for claims that it's institutionally misogynistic, the Metropolitan Police, and yet, never mind your support for Priti Patel, Jackson's more interested in why you continue to be so supportive of the police officer who presides over all of this.
Look, I think this is more than one person. You've used the word institution. This is about an institutional issue which needs to be looked into. So Her Majesty's Inspectorate have been looking into the vetting practices and issues around the issues raised in Morgan. The Home Secretary has told them to report before the end of this year, which I think is really important to get speedy responses from Her Majesty's Inspectorate. At the same time, as the Independent Office for Police Conduct are looking into this. But on top of all those things, I think it's right and proper. There should be a QC-led inquiry starting immediately, looking into both Sarah Everard, but the wider issues you've touched upon, which the HMI are looking into, as indeed are the IPC.
I know that you're limited by time, and you're saying that there is a touch of, inevitably, and quite fairly, a touch of wait and see. But you're not really addressing the question. It's all very well saying it's not down to one individual. But one individual is in charge of the whole show, and she has presided over an astonishing cavalcade of incompetence stroke corruption, and she's untouchable.
Just to reassure you, and more importantly listeners, my job isn't just to support the police, it's also to hold them to account. And I can reassure listeners that I do hold the Commissioner to account, as indeed does the Home Secretary. Let me give you an example of the Sarah Everard case. The man responsible joined Kent Police first, then transferred to the Civil Nuclear Constabulary, and then transferred to the Met. So I accept the Met has a role to play in relation to what happened in that particular case, but so does Kent and the Civil Nuclear Constabulary. But also there are issues around culture in police forces up and down the country. That's why part 2 of the inquiry is looking at all 43 police forces, as well as, which includes the Met, to get to the bottom of this, but also to make sure there's permanent, meaningful change. 2
quick questions. What would you do if someone in your office was nicknamed the rapist?
Well, that's one of the things that the inquiry is looking into, because it can't be right whether it's the rapist, whether it's, I'm not sure if that person will still be working for me if that was the case.
And what would you say to a young woman who is stopped by the police this evening with what appears to be a kosher warrant card? What would you tell them to do to ensure that the officer is as kosher as the warrant card, or the incident is as kosher as the warrant card?
Well, I think it's not incumbent upon the woman to take steps, it's incumbent on the police to take steps.
Tonight it is. Tonight she gets stopped. He shows a card. What does she do?
Well, what we've done, as far as the police are concerned, is no police officer should be by himself in plain clothes, because we need to make sure there's that reassurances for the police to do that job, not the woman or the girl.
Sorry to badger you, but what if he is? What does she do?
We know from the experience of Sarah Everard, but also from listening to strong, independent-minded women, that they would, I'm afraid, follow the advice of the police, because that's what they've been brought up to do, because we police by consent.
So what would you advise them to do?
Well,
I've heard, get a bus, ring 999.
Well, listen, look, the advice from the police is to make sure that you are reassured before you get into the car. The advice from the police is don't be afraid to ring 999. But the police have changed their practice and procedure as a consequence of understanding the lack of confidence all of us share with women and girls in particular, that's arisen from the Sarah Everard case. And what I don't want to do, James, is go around victim blaming or asking women to change.
No, that's not fair. No one's victim blaming. I'm asking for a specific circumstance, and you are saying that woman should ring 999.
If she's worried about the police officer, but hopefully what should be happening now is very, very few, and there are exceptional circumstances of a police officer being in plain clothes when approaching a woman, because the police understand that the confidence has been shattered, particularly amongst women and girls in the police service. And that's why it's so important for us to have a speedy inquiry to make sure things change. And that's why it's really important across the country.
I'm not being clear, but I understand what you're doing. You want to reassure people that this is highly, highly, highly unlikely to happen. But if you are genuinely concerned about the probity of the apparent police officer stopping you in the street and ordering you into a car, then the last resort would be to ring 999 and seek confirmation that this is
normally, James, and you raise an important one, normally I would discourage people to ring 999.
I know.
Emergency. On this occasion, I'm saying don't. I'm saying do ring 999.
Okay. Thank you. On with the calls.
The next caller, by the way, Jackson, thanks for your call.
Thank you, Jackson.
The next caller is somewhere a bit further afield. It's Leeds, and it's Tom. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning. I'll keep it quite simple and short and sweet. I come into London a lot. I see a lot of people struggling daily. How can you justify extending the ultra-low emission zone when absolute loads of people are struggling now? And also, are you going to give up your armoured Range Rover for something cheaper to help the cut emissions?
Well, Tom, thanks for your question. How do you come to London? What's your mode of travel?
I'm in haulage. I do haulage.
So you drive a lorry into London?
Yes.
Right.
And I see absolute millions.
Yeah, sure,
I see thousands of people struggling.
Sure.
It's horrible.
And is your lorry ULEZ compliant?
Yes, it's Euro 6. It's completely up to date.
Well, thank you. Because as a consequence of my policies, you're now emitting far less toxic stuff into our air than you were previously. Because previously, Tom, the lorry you drive into our city was emitting nitrogen oxide, was emitting carbon, and emitting particulate matter. And it's partly responsible for children in our city having permanently stunted lungs and adults having a whole host of health issues, from asthma to dementia to cancer, which led to, on an annual basis, Tom, 4,000 premature deaths in our city. And let me tell you the good news, Tom. Because of the policies you don't like, but you're now following, we've managed to reduce toxic air in the centre of our city by almost a half. And we're seeing for the first time life expectancy for those children going upwards. But I'm not content for just the centre of my city to have cleaner air. I want all of my city to have cleaner air, which is why I'm extending it out across up to the North Circular and South Circular by October the 25th. And let me tell you this, Tom. It's the poorest Londoners least likely to own a car who suffer the worst consequences of poor quality air. So I'm grateful to you for changing your lorry to make sure it's ULEZ compliant. But let me tell you this. As a consequence of our policies, now 80% of our vehicles in London are ULEZ compliant. I think the twin challenges of air pollution and climate change are ones that politicians should bravely take on rather than ducking these tough issues.
And what do you say to the I don't know why I said young, to the small business person who thinks currently that they might not be able to afford to make the changes they need to make when the zone is extended?
Well, we've been helping record numbers of small businesses, charities and those in low incomes to move away from polluting
vehicles. What would you say to them today? What do they do?
Apply to the scrappage scheme. I've put more money into the scrappage scheme. It's now £61 million. You can go on the TfL website to apply to the scrappage scheme. But also sometimes people think they're not ULEZ compliant where they are. You can also go into the TfL website, type in your number plate, see if you're ULEZ compliant. We've got to address the issue of both air pollution and climate change, and it's something I feel quite strongly about. And I don't apologise, by the way, James, let me be quite clear, for having bold policies to clean up the air in our city.
Just let me check the Daily Mail website to make sure I get my facts correct. What about your £300,000 5-litre armoured Range Rover that drives you to work while commuters endure packed tube trains and drivers face a new £15 congestion charge?
Let me deal with that, Tom. I apologise, I didn't deal with that question. So I came to the studio today by tube with a number of police officers who are armed, being on the tube with me to ensure that the threat to my life doesn't become a reality. The armoured, bulletproof, whatever you want to call it, car that the police drive me around in sometimes is the same car that the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary and others whose position leads them to have, needing security have. My security that the police, by the way, assessed that I need isn't because of my job as mayor. Let me be quite clear. Previous mayors haven't had this protection, and I hope future mayors don't. James, you and I have discussed this. One of the reasons for the threats is the religion I belong to and the colour of my skin. And so, Tom, I don't want to use police officers to protect me. I said no for a long, long time. But I've been persuaded to say yes to police protection because it's not just me that the issue here. It's people who are around me. So today, for example, Tom, I have 3 members of staff here with me. It's the threat to them that concerns me. And when I'm out and about in my private life with my family, it's the threat to my wife and kids that cause me concern.
What was the clincher? What made you change your mind?
It was the duty of care I owed to my staff. It was when my chief of staff...
You had that when you were resisting?
Yeah, the first year. But in quite stark terms, the police came and spoke to both my chief of staff and my wife was spoken to. And when you read some of the stuff that's kept from me, when you hear some of the stuff that's been said, and when you understand the consequences of not having that, it's a clincher.
Back to the Mail. Sadiq Khan uses cavalcade of cars to drive 4.5 miles to walk his dog, even though there's a park close to his street, hours after unveiling pollution plan, I think, pollution report. I mean, respond to that specifically if you would, and then just a brief word on how, given what you've just said about the context of your security requirements. How this sort of journalism makes you feel?
Well, look, on a daily basis, there are photographers outside my house, and nearly every day there aren't photographs in the newspapers because I try and walk and cycle and use public transport where I can. Sometimes I defer to the instructions and advice I get from the really hard-working, fantastic team of police officers who look after me. I think to suggest I can only go to a park near my home is a bit unfair. I mean, we've got great parks and commons in London, from St James's Park to Hyde Park to Battersea Park. So I'm unclear what I should be doing. Should there be a zone that I can only visit because it's in walking distance? I mean, if the suggestion is I walk 4.5 miles to a park, go for a walk there and then walk 4.5 miles back, then they should say that. But I'm unclear what I should have done in the circumstances where I've got police protection. I make this point not to pick on the Prime Minister or the Home Secretary or the Foreign Secretary, but I don't see stories about them, because I suspect, those who write these stories need to explain. But I'm going to carry on doing what I can to walk and cycle, use public transport, and where the advice is to use a police vehicle, I will do so. I'm not going to be worried about these sorts of stories, except to say, of course, it is upsetting because, it gives an impression that I'm somehow choosing to drive around in, these luxurious cars. It ain't fun having police protection. It ain't fun not being able to do things spontaneously. It ain't fun having to tell the police team, and by the way, huge respect for them who work incredibly hard, at least 24 hours, 40 hours in advance what I plan to do. It ain't fun being able to tell people I'm going to come to an event in case it gets out, and that leads to all sorts of challenges. But I appreciate that in the current circumstances, I've got to do what I can to make sure I follow the advice I'm given.
I suppose people like Tom asking that question proves that whatever the tactics that the newspaper is employing here are working in a way. But Mark is still unconvinced. He says, claptrap and flannel juice. Why do you need a convoy and an armed guard? When Boris was mayor, he rode a bike and Ken Livingstone used the tube. They all had threats against them. I mean, I thought you said that this was the police's assessment of the situation, which would have been different, would it, from your predecessors? Yeah,
so actually Ken Livingstone did have protection for 48 hours after the 7/7 bombers in 2005, just a factual correction. What happens is, I'm not giving away anything I shouldn't, is there are regular risk assessments undertaken by police, operational issues in relation to security. Some ambassadors, by the way, it's, again, not a secret, the Israeli ambassador gets protection, the US ambassador. So there are reasons why some people, because of the job they're doing, get protection, but also individuals can get protection as well. These are individual risk assessments made. I don't decide on the protection, and it isn't fun. People think it's fun, it's great, it's some sort of status symbol. It isn't. I would much rather be using the tube, the bus, public transport, cycling, and so forth, and I do when I can, which does create logistical nightmares for the protection team, but they understand that I'm keen to live my life as normal as I can, but sometimes I won't be able to.
It's forgivable and understandable that people like Mark and Tom may not know this, may not understand the process that leads to this apportioning. But the people who write the articles must, or at least the editors of the newspapers must.
Oh, because we speak to them, because sometimes they've put a photograph of my home up and we've got to ring them up and say, listen, by the way, that's not really sensible because you're basically telling the whole world where somebody who's a target lives. And so, of course they do. And actually the mainstream press are usually very responsible and stuff. And so it's for them to answer what public interest there is in the story. Yes, interesting to the public. What's the public interest? Tom, thanks for your call from Leeds. We've got a call from Hampton now, and it's Joe. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Mayor Khan. I'm calling because I travel on the DLR regularly. We've just got our first grandchild. And
congratulations.
The mask, thank you, and the mask wearing there is that I would say about 20% of people wear masks correctly. And I know it's not the law at the moment, but it is the rules of London transport. And I wondered what you are going to do to comply, to try and make people comply with it.
They're a bit thin on the ground at the Labour Party conference. Not quite as thin as they were in Manchester this week, but there wasn't exactly an enthusiastic uptake, even in the conference rooms.
Yeah, Joe, congratulations as well. So Joe was on the trains, and there are fewer staff there for a variety of reasons. But you're right that the take up of face masks is not great. I came in on the Northern Line today, and I reckon 7 out of 10 people in my carriage had a face mask on. More staff on the Northern Line for a variety of reasons. But you're right, Joe. One of the reasons why I was keen to persuade the government to carry on with the national requirement for face masks, or if they weren't willing to do that, to give me the powers to pass a bylaw for it to continue to be an offence, was for enforcement reasons, Joe. At the moment, it's our limited staff who are doing the job of enforcement. If it was still a law, not only would it deter people from, not wearing a face mask, but also it means we could use the Met Police and British Transport Police to enforce it. I'm still trying to persuade the government, Joe, to give me the powers to bring in a bylaw or to bring back the national requirement. And this gives me a good chance while I'm on LBC, Joe, to explain to listeners why it's so important. Look, if you wear a face mask, it reduces the chances of transmission. And bearing in mind, 1 out of 3 people who've got this virus don't realise they've got it. It's one of the most unselfish things you can do. So there's no downside to wearing a face mask. It may be slightly inconvenient.
It's game over. I've heard. I mean, no offence to you, but we've heard all this before, and I think Joe recognises it's game over now for whatever reason. But the political leadership at a national level.
If that was the case, though, James, how do you explain on my
you got
tube
lucky.
journey?
You got lucky.
No.
Someone else will text me now and say the tube they were on had 2 people wearing a mask out of 200.
But so one alternative is just to give up.
Well, I'm suggesting that you haven't, but actually, the game is up.
What?
I still wear a mask.
And the person sitting next to you may not be catching the transmission because you're wearing one, right? Because you may have had the pandemic and not realise you've had it. So, something is better than nothing. But Joe, I'm the first person to accept this is not ideal.
You've got central government calling for masks and then being photographed around the cabinet table, practically sitting on each other's laps with not a single mask in the room.
Yeah, and one of the points we've made as well, Joe, is the symbolic importance of people being seen to wear a mask. By the way, I met with leading American politicians, John Kerry being one example, and they wear a face mask indoors because they're required to by law in America in federal buildings. And that's a good example of leadership, and that leads to, some people seeing people they respect or people in positions of power and influence doing something.
We're still knocking out 30,000, 40,000 new cases a day. It doesn't get spoken about, but it puts us in the top 2 or 3 in the world still on a daily basis. It's very odd, isn't it? And the number of deaths, of course, is now never mentioned. And this is not something I obviously can hold you responsible for, but it is a little bit like weeing in the wind, isn't it? When the political direction of traffic is going in the opposite way.
Well, listen, I'm never defeatist, but actually, to be fair, to give it some context, James, the figures actually are quite good in the sense that we now have more and more people who have received both jabs, some now getting the booster jab. We have fewer deaths because of COVID than we had previously. And also in London in particular, the number of cases is one of the lowest across the country. So that's the good news. I'm not complacent at all.
Sure. But
that's why we've got to be vigilant. And Joe, I know how frustrating it is for you because you're seeing your new grandchild. You're worried you may have the virus. And that's why I'd also ask people to continue to take lateral flow tests themselves every few days just to check whether you've got this virus, because you'll kick yourselves if you've got the virus, you're not showing symptoms and you pass it on to somebody else who may be vulnerable, because as James says, people are still dying.
Brief answer, when are you going to reopen the night tube fully?
I'll have an announcement in the next couple of weeks.
Will you?
Yeah. Listen, I mean, we've been trying to bring it back. TfL have worked incredibly hard to bring it back. If I could explain the reason why it's not been possible up until now, a combination of the government deal and the lack of revenues we have, but also the train operators have been moved to other lines in the daytime to make sure those lines can carry on running because of the pandemic, and so forth. I'm hoping to make an announcement in the next couple of weeks because I understand the importance of the night tube, not simply for women's safety, really important issue, additionally for the nighttime economy as well. In the meantime, we've made sure that the last tubes from central London carry on running until 1 o'clock in the early hours of the morning and start again at 5:30. And across London, we've still got night buses going across London, but I understand the importance of the night tube. And so hopefully,
we look forward to that.
I'll have an announcement.
And what's the score with petrol? I noticed a Financial Times journalist this morning heading out of London, my local petrol station, the BP station, and I'm sure this will play well in Leith and Cardiff, but the BP station on the M4 is shut again. What's your understanding of the current situation?
So because the army have finally been called in, I was calling for them for the last 2 weeks. We now have, we think, 70% of our petrol stations in London receiving some fuel yesterday. Across the country, it's better. And when you continue to have petrol being provided to our petrol stations, you'll be aware it ain't just the shortage of petrol. There's the shortage of food in our shops. There's concerns in relation to the supply chain. So we are worried in the lead up to autumn and Christmas. The fuel shortage is the first of many shortages. That's why it's so important for the government to get a grip in relation to not just
when do you think
haulage.
normal service? Completely normal. What's your information? What are you being told?
At least a few days. At
worst?
At worst, a few weeks.
Really?
Yeah.
A few weeks is a fairly meaningless phrase. I mean, what, 10, 2, 8,
we went
4.5?
We went from below 50% last week to
Yes.
71% today. There's almost 200 army helping out. As long as we can carry on those numbers of armed services helping out.
So we don't really know, but you're confident it'll be over by Christmas.
Well, no, I'm not. The problem is this. Let me show why I say that, because the armed services can't stay forever delivering petrol.
Sure.
Right. So at some stage they're going to move on to other things, and so in the short term, I'm confident in the next few days we'll have enough petrol in our petrol stations. Question what happens in the next few weeks with the current emergency supplies we've got being provided by the armed services. There isn't an issue with enough petrol. The issue is getting the petrol from the depots to the stations, and that's why the army have been literally a lifesaver.
What about immigration and labour shortages, particularly in London, where you are mayor? How would you fix them right now? If you could, put something in place by Christmas that would all of these for hire signs up in windows, all of these companies reporting they can't operate at full capacity, restaurants not opening for lunches, and staff not. What would you do? How would you get the bodies back into these buildings?
I speak to businesses on a daily basis. We've got two big issues: a labour shortage and a skills shortage. What I would do is bring in an emergency COVID recovery visa to allow people to come from other parts of the world in those sectors where we need skills. Sometimes, by the way, it's labour, not skills.
Yes.
Secondly, I would open up to...
How long would that last for, that COVID recovery visa?
It'd have to be at least a year.
Okay.
In the short term, we've got to accept that we need, labour.
You could do that because of where you stood on the Brexit debate, but do you understand why that's unlikely to be done by the Vote Leave government?
Well, I say to the government, if you don't want to call it a Brexit recovery visa, call it a COVID recovery visa, right?
Well,
you can blame the pandemic as they're doing for most other things. So
they call it liberty of motion. That's not freedom of movement.
Well,
There's all sorts of wordplay that.
Well, we know the Prime Minister is quite good at words and playing with them, and so that's what I'm saying. Call it a COVID recovery visa if you like, because think about the sectors: hospitality, haulage, construction, culture, loads of areas. Secondly, you can allow into the UK from other parts of the world, like you do from Australia, New Zealand and elsewhere, young people under the age of 30 to help out. Thirdly, you've got to really invest in skills to give people the skills for the jobs that are being created in the skills economy, which is really important.
Have you been surprised to hear the Prime Minister criticising businesses for not being prepared for the problems that the Prime Minister told businesses would never happen?
Well, on the one hand, business leaders were accused of being architects of Project Fair, where they were simply articulating some of the concerns they had if we left the European Union and left the European Union with a bad deal. They were told, you got Project Fair, don't worry, it won't be like you predict. Now it is as they predicted, and they're being criticised for making plans for things that the government said were not going to happen. So, and businesses are angry because businesses have done all that was asked of them, and now they're being criticised.
I was going to squeeze in one more call, but I think a decision has been taken that we're out of time. So actually, no, I'm going to squeeze. Can we squeeze in?
Of course we can. Of course we can.
Veronica.
Veronica from Sutton. Good morning, Veronica. Thank you so much for your patience.
No worries. Good morning, Sadiq. No, I wanted to follow up on an earlier question. It is regarding vaccinations in schools to 12 to 15-year-olds. You've probably noticed there's a rising absence, again, because COVID is rife in many schools and in secondary schools. And unfortunately, even though it was announced, albeit late, in September, it hasn't actually really started. I mean, I think the national figures are way below 10% of the 12 to 15-year-olds being vaccinated so far. And even once they're vaccinated, they're not even eligible for a second jab. So I just want to understand, I know what power or influence you can have into getting the schools within London up and running, because also is linked to the other point around masks, because, they're not wearing masks either in schools, so they're not getting vaccinated.
Masks not supposed to be coming back. Is that? Have I not read today that schools are bringing masks back?
So, Veronica, you raised a really important issue. So by half term, which begins on October the 25th, an offer of the vaccine should be made to all our schools in London, which would be great. The 12 to 15-year-olds would be great. Lots of progress made for those above the age of 60. So that's really important. Secondly, James and you are both right to mention the issue of face masks. So head teachers now are, in some schools, asking their children to wear face masks because it does reduce transmission. So you're seeing more and more of that as well. But you're also right, Veronica, we are seeing more and more bubbles being excluded from schools because of worries about the virus spreading. And that's why we've really got to encourage the uptake of the vaccine. One of the problems, Veronica, is because, and it's not, for understandable reasons, you need the consent of parents. If a parent or carer is hesitant and not keen on the vaccine being given to their children, that leads to fewer children receiving the vaccine than they should. So Public Health England, in its new guise, the National Health Service, are doing what they can to reassure parents about the efficacy of the vaccine. But it is really important that we don't have what we had over the last 18 months, which is children being outside the classroom, because I'm afraid it's often the poorest children who need to be in the classroom who miss out on education, and we can't afford them to miss out on education. That's why it's so important, if you're offered the jab, to please take it. But also our teachers are working incredibly hard with staff to keep children inside the classroom where they can. But for obvious reasons, if somebody's tested positive, they got to do the sensible thing.
Veronica, thank you. Final question, I promise. Why do you think misogyny, and we're working on the dictionary definition of the word, not Dominic Raab's, why do you think misogyny should be a hate crime?
I've seen in other protected characteristics, think of race, think of sexual orientation, and others, where it is a hate crime. What it leads to is a change in culture in that police service, in the criminal justice service, but also it means they judge can give a longer sentence because that protected characteristic is an aggravating feature. I'm afraid misogyny isn't a hate crime, which means often it's not recorded. Some police forces are recording it, and the evidence is those police forces that record it, there's been a change of culture, best example being Nottingham. But also a judge has got the powers to give a longer sentence if the victim being a woman is an aggravating feature. In addition to misogyny being a hate crime, I also think there's a whole host of things need to happen to address the issue of the way women are treated and girls are treated, from proper healthy relationship education in primary school and secondary school.
Education of men.
Of men. We've got to prevent the violence occurring in the first place, rather than focusing all our attention on what happens afterwards to the victims who are women and girls. And I think, one of the things we've got to do, by the way, James, is just basic education of people in positions of power and influence, not just the Deputy Prime Minister, but others as well.
Sadiq Khan, Mayor of London, many thanks indeed for your monthly visit to the studio.
Stay safe.
And you. 20 minutes to 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC.
LBC.